Hello, I'm Nicole Alexander and I'm the author of The Cedar Tree. Here's my book. And I'm delighted to be with you today, taking part in the Penguin Random House Virtual Literary Festival, coming into your home while we're all in captivity. And because of that, I guess it's wonderful that, we can come together to share our love of reading, our passion for the written word, for books. So today in this session, I'm going to talk a little bit about my novel, The Cedar Tree, give you the plot outline, some of the history from the period, and also share some of my research experiences and stories from those experiences, which included a trek in the Strzelecki Desert. So first of all, to the novel itself. Cedar Tree has a dual narrative. It's set in the 1860s and the 1940s. In Ireland, the big scrub in the Richmond Valley of northern New South Wales and the Strzelecki Desert. And it follows two generations of the Irish Orion family. The story begins in 1949, when Stella Orion flees her home, a barren sheep property on the edge of the Strzelecki Desert. Now she leaves behind the graves of her husband Joe and a baby daughter. She has very little money and limited options, so she accepts an offer from her brother-in-law Harry to go and stay at the Orion cane farm in the Richmond Valley. While she's there, Stella hopes to get some answers to the questions that have plagued her during her marriage. However, she discovers that Harry is a hard man. He refuses to talk about his dead younger brother and also forbids Stella from speaking to a neighbour on an adjoining property. Now, the disputes within the Orion family began almost a century earlier, when Irish cousins Brandon, Maggie and Sean Orion also fled their home, County Tipperary, as wanted criminals. By 1867, Brandon and Sean are working in the big scrub as cedar cutters. But while Brandon is really keen to embrace the opportunities his new life offers, Sean can't let go of the past. And it's the choices that these cousins make during their lifetime which ultimately affects their descendants, including a young Italian woman, Stella Moretti, who marries into the Orion family during the Second World War. So to touch on the historical background behind the Cedar Tree, I thought I'd talk a little bit about the 1860s, which was a very volatile but interesting time in Australia's history. From the 1860s onwards, we see a huge influx of Irish coming to Australia. But unfortunately, a lot of these settlers had quite negative views towards Protestant English. This was because during the Great Famine, food exports from Ireland to the UK were not halted, and that was at the request at the British government. Now, this in turn inflated food prices in Ireland, placing it out of the hands of many, particularly the poor. But it also exacerbated the effects of the potato blight, which decimated a lot of crops, but particularly in the poorer counties of Ireland. Now, the hardships experienced during the Great Famine were made worse by some fairly draconian British laws during that period as well. For example, poor tenant farmers were forced to pay a tithe to the English church. Now, if you were a poor Catholic farmer struggling, to put food on the table, you could imagine the animosities that arose when you were forced to pay a tithe to the English Protestant church. So that then leads us to the political snapshot of the period. So the Fenian Brotherhood and the Irish Republican Brotherhood were organisations dedicated to the establishment of an independent Irish Republic in the 19th and early 20th centuries. There was a Fenian movement in Australia. It was limited to certain pockets around the country, according to historians from the period. And in the Cedar Tree, Sean becomes a part of that, in some respects, quite violent movement. Now, these Fenian rumblings in the narrative are played out alongside the 1861 Robertson's Land Act of New South Wales, which is when the governor bowed to pressure from settlers to basically end the monopoly that squatters had over huge tracts of land in the colony. So after the introduction of the Act, gradually, over a number of years, we see increasing numbers of settlers moving into New South Wales, all of them keen to stake a claim. But in a lot of cases, it was on land previously owned by these great pastoralists. This led to numerous conflicts over land disputes. Now, the squatters of the day took the view that the governor was stealing their land via the Act, land that over the previous decades only they had had the fortitude to settle and manage. The would-be selectors, on the other hand, whether they were honest farmers or dodgy land speculators, took the view that they were entitled to land under the Act. So we had these huge disputes over land ownership, and in some cases they actually devolved into physical conflict. So that also becomes part of the narrative in the Cedar Tree. A section of the Cedar Tree is also set during the, within the Big Scrub in the Northern Rivers area of New South Wales. Now, the Big Scrub was once the largest lowland subtropical rainforest in Australia. Prior to European settlement, it covered 75,000 hectares. By 1900, if you can believe it, only 1% of that magnificent rainforest remained. Now, this was because the Big Scrub was full of quality timber, and none was more valuable than the red cedar tree, which came to be known as red gold because of its value, and also because it was considered to be equal to digging up a large gold nugget, far more accessible, because all a man needed was an axe, a crosscut saw, and a river, so he could float green logs downstream to market. Now, the cedar timber itself was highly valued by furniture makers, the Royal Navy, ship and house builders, and the cedar getters were very savvy men. They didn't mind consuming huge amounts of rum from great vats while they were within timber camps, and certainly when they came into villages to get supplies at the end of a season, they were known for stirring up trouble as well. But as I said, they were savvy men. They would actually follow the newspaper reports of the day to see where the most recent surveyors and explorers had been. And if it was to areas that were similar to where previous stands of cedar had been found, they would rush there to fill the demand for wood. So the cedar industry, the timber industry on a whole, is really considered to be vital to that early period of Australia's economic development. They're credited with the establishment of numerous inland towns and villages, and of course a massive shipbuilding and shipping trade, because we had to get those valuable logs to different markets. But of course, as happens so regularly in history, economic considerations took over from environmental ones, and today only remnants of that magnificent rainforest remain. Well, now I'd like to briefly touch on my research in the Strzelecki Desert. So this involves the 1940s section of the Cedar Tree, when I have a young Italian woman, Stella Moretti, marrying Joe Orion, a descendant of Brandon and Sean's, and actually moving out to a sheep property on the edge of the Strzelecki Desert. Now, I chose that area for two reasons. One, it's a wonderful contrast, the lushness of the Richmond Valley and the cane fields, etc., and the timber industry compared to the barrenness of a desert. And secondly, I wanted city-bred Italian Stella to be really cut off from civilization and constrained by the environment that she moves to, the vastness of it. So I decided that I wanted the fictitious property that Stella and Joe moved to once they were married to be located on the New South Wales-South Australian border, close to the wild dog fence, and across from Lake Frome in South Australia, which is a large, shallow salt pan. So I literally wanted Stella to taste the salt on her tongue when a hot westerly blew. I wanted her to feel totally removed from civilization. Using a number of different pastoral lease maps and general maps of New South Wales, I pinpointed the location for my property and was very fortunate to get to stay on one of those outback stations for a week to do my research. I spent my days reading through the archives from that property from the 1940s, when they were actually a sheep property. I'll share a couple of things I discovered from that. One, if you're running sheep on the edges of a desert, you're going to get sand in your fleece. And each year is different depending on the weather conditions, but it does mean that quite often a fleece could be downgraded come sale time because of the sand in the wool. Second thing is it's the 1940s in that section of the novel. The Great War is in full swing. So labour is scarce across Australia, and no more so than in those really remote rural areas. Imagine the difficulty of trying to find staff to work in those areas and mustering in 5,000 or 10,000 head of sheep. Sometimes men were doing it by themselves. The government at the time, the state government, as with other governments across Australia as well, decided to employ a shearers team, circuits of these men who would go round the different wool sheds in New South Wales and make sure the clip got to market. This was because the Australian government was under contract to the British government during the Second World War, much as we had been during the First World War, to supply wool for uniforms. So that was my evening time, spending, my hours reading through the station archives, but during the day I traipsed through the desert. Now, the Strzelecki Desert is an extraordinary environment of quartz rock deposits, gibber plains, stony plains, and these red rolling dunes. And the further west you go, the larger the dunes become, the redder and the more stunted the vegetation. The Strzelecki dune fields are actually part of the Australian continental dune fields, which originate in Central Australia. But the Strzelecki dunes themselves are mainly confined to the Lake Eyre Basin, and that extends over into the far west of New South Wales, which is we know as corner country, and I'm sure some of you have been to that extraordinary part of New South Wales. The dunes themselves in that part of New South Wales are made up of sandy deposits that have blown in from the interior, so coming across from the west. Now, when I was doing my research out in the desert, I was walking through the dunes for 6 or 7 hours a day. I had my backpack, I had water, food, sunscreen, compass, maps, camera, pen and paper. That was only for a day trip. It's a very arid environment and it's extremely easy to become lost because basically everything really does look the same. When I was out there, I was very mindful about early explorers who trekked through that part of the world and the difficulties they faced. You needed to have so many supplies on hand to survive if you didn't understand the environment. And of course, as we know from history, many of our explorers suffered fairly grisly ends. Indigenous Australians, on the other hand, have been wandering those arid interior regions for thousands of years, living off the native vegetation, wildlife, and within the Strzelecki dune fields, accessing water by digging down between the dunes where there's shallow seepage wells. Now, I dug and dug on a number of occasions when I was out there and I never found any water, so I was glad I had my supplies. Charles Sturt, the great explorer, went through that particular area I visited in 1844 and camped by Floods Creek, which actually runs through the property that I stayed on. I'm gathering that there was water then, because apparently Floods Creek only floods once every 20 years. You have to love Australia's humour when it comes to naming things. So that part of my research was, really important. For me, when it comes to in the field research, which I guess I really class as feeding my inner Indiana Jones, I do like to contrast the landscapes in stories where possible. But the other thing is that when I'm writing about Australia's history, I'm very conscious of the fact that as individuals, we're defined by our environment. It gives us our sense of place in the world. And when it comes to Australian history, we're talking isolation, remoteness, difficulties obtaining everything from medical help to even, staffing, as I mentioned earlier. And with this story partially set in a remote region of New South Wales, it becomes even more important to understand the landscape that my characters are living in because they're moulded and defined by their environment. And certainly with Stella in the 1940s section of the Cedar Tree, the Strzelecki Desert does become part of the environment that really does constrain her and almost suffocate her at one stage. So for those of you who don't know, I'm a fourth generation grazier. My family have actually been in the northwest of New South Wales since 1893. And I'm fortunate enough to have quite a few archives I can draw on when I'm researching my novels. So old paddock books, station diaries, mail order catalogues and magazines, that type of thing. They range from the 1890s through to the 1950s and 60s. So you could say that the Alexander family are hoarders. But of course, that written material is primary source material when it comes to researching an historical novel set in this country. So it lends the amount of authenticity that, even searching through records through Trove or wherever else I might find resources really can't beat. The other thing is that those magazines and mail order catalogues from that period means that I have first-hand information, once again, depending on the year I'm writing about, that I can draw on from that type of information. So I've been very fortunate in that regard. The other thing is that I do come from a family of storytellers. So these wonderful stories have been passed down through the generations. Now, all stories, but particularly stories that originate in the bush, have to be taken with a grain of salt. But once again, they can become, interesting fodder when you were looking at crafting a novel. To finish off, I just wanted to share a couple of stories from my research expeditions. First of all, from the Richmond Valley in northern New South Wales, where I learnt firsthand at the Lismore Historical Society of the angst between Protestants and Catholics from the 1860s onwards and up until the early 1900s. So we had Protestants and Catholics crossing the road so they didn't walk on the same side as each other. We had them throwing eggs at each other, rotten eggs being left in people's mailboxes, and people making the decision not to frequent a particular business because they were of the other religion. So that's just a brief outline of what was happening in that part of the world from a religion point of view. When we head out to the Strzelecki Desert, as you would expect, the stories are a little different. For example, in the 1940s, there was a woman living on a fairly remote property with her husband, no children. And apparently she simply grew sick and tired of eating the same meal every night for dinner, which was pretty much mutton, which is aged lamb, and potatoes. She complained to her husband. Her husband didn't listen. So after her request for a few changes to be made falling on deaf ears, she went to the woolshed on the property and found some arsenic. Arsenic was a poison that was used to, eradicate feral animals such as wild dogs, etc. This woman began to add a little bit of arsenic to her husband's meal every evening. Now, apparently she did this for a good 12 months. And her husband was still going strong, so obviously he was a fairly sturdy man. She became totally fed up and impatient, so she gave him one good final dose of arsenic, which did the job, and apparently he died the next day. When the doctor, a distant doctor as you would imagine, finally arrived on the property to take care of the body, because there had obviously been a few queries as to what was going on out there, the doctor made the comment that if she'd kept on going, just gradually adding the poison for a couple of more months, she probably would have got away with it. But that final dose apparently left some clear signs of what she'd been up to. The final story that I'll leave you with is of the stockmen in those remoter regions who would say goodbye to their wives, their families, get on their horses and go out to check watering points, livestock or fences, and simply never return. Now, it's said that they became disorientated in the backcountry, that perhaps they ran out of water. Locally, it's just stated that they actually suffered a fit of the willies, became disorientated and never returned. And indeed, some of these men who did get lost were never found. So thank you for listening to my session. It's been a bit up and down here as far as distractions are concerned, because there's actually a storm going on outside and a bit of lightning. So, but we got through it all. So thank you very much, and I hope you enjoy the cedar tree.